Okay, I have my pattern with the seam allowances all ready to go, and so now I'm going to cut it out on a sheet of cardstock paper. Just anything that's got a little bit of stiffness to it would work good. I am working with a photocopy of the pattern with the seam allowances just because you can see on the bottom right hand side of the screen I have the demo piece I did in the first video still assembled together, and I happen to have access to a copier. Um, you can use your utility knife, an X-Acto knife, or a scissors to cut out these shapes, whatever your preferred method is. The piece that goes all the way around the shoe is a little bit long for my photocopier, but also for my cardstock. So I'm kind of having to problem solve around that. What I have decided to do is that I'm going to break it up into 3 pieces. I'm going to have a shorter piece that's around the toe box that maybe acts as a little bit of a design element, and then the other 2 pieces will go around the side and the back. This will allow me to cut it out of my remaining cardstock. Now I'm just sort of eyeballing where those cuts are going to go, but you could measure if you wanted. Here I am adding little tabs, basically extending that piece because the other one will overlap that, so I need it to just have a little bit of extra. That also gives wiggle room for adjusting the size if you need. This was the piece that went around the side of my shoe, and it does not have any seam allowances, so I'm just tracing this directly onto the cardstock. But one of the things that you'll need to do is transfer on all of your pieces those notch marks so that you can line up your pieces again. So here I am just making a simple way of transferring marks by just taking a number 2 pencil and shading a big chunk onto a sheet of scrap paper. You put that shaded area face down and just apply pressure over it. So I'm using a lead pencil, but you could use a ballpoint pen. And I can see the marks fairly well in person. On screen it's a little harder to see them, but it's enough for me to get the information that I need. So I'm just going to continue to transfer those lines. If you have a softer graphite pencil that you could work with, you can get more distinguished lines, make sort of stronger tracing paper, but just a regular number 2 works. So I'm cutting out all those strips, and I'm not going to glue them together right now, but I'm just taping them so that I remember how they go together. That piece to me is always the sort of most complex, and so I don't want to forget what I did by the time I got there. And then I'm also just going to tack the pattern pieces back together so I can remember how that assembled. Okay, so with the simple little tracing paper that I made, I'm going to continue to do that with my other forms. I am showing you that you could also take a bone folder or something and kind of just compress those lines in, but it wasn't very visible, and you also can't erase those lines, and so I just went back to the tracing paper that I had made. And I always double check to make sure that all the lines that I needed transferred before I opened them up. And if you notice, I'm also making sure that I'm not just transferring the notch marks, but also the seam allowances that I drew. Now, if you happen to have a bone folder, you can trace along that seam allowance to help create a little groove or a channel where it'll fold a little easier. But again, this is not a necessary step. You'll see sometimes I use it and sometimes I don't, and I kind of end up with similar results. Stiffer paper, just like with your pattern mock-up, it's going to need to have these notches in it, but stiffer paper really is going to need that assistance to help it bend and flex. So initially I was just sort of guessing where those notches go. A tighter curve requires a smaller notch. Larger curves you can get away with a little more space. But the other thing you can do, which is what I started to do here, was just fold over a section along the curve until you notice it starts to jut away from your seam allowance. And where that starts to jut away, where you see that little shadow, that's where a new cut needs to happen. So I can fold until I see it starting to veer away from my seam allowance, and then I can cut there. And as I continue to make my way around this curve, those notches become further and further apart. And at that point, I don't even need a notch. That basically isn't a curve. And it's totally up to you what you want to do, whether you're guessing or whether you are using that sort of little folding method. I'll need to do the same thing with the base of the shoe. Here I haven't used a bone folder at all. I do a little bit of folding to kind of test, and then also eventually just guess. So I've made my way around the form, and now I'm folding all of those tabs in along the seam allowance. That's how I'm going to glue and assemble the form together. You can see in that back curve how those notches will end up overlapping one another. On this back piece, I don't need to fold in the sides because those are going to be places where they'll just overlap with glue, but I do need to do that bottom because that will be a curve that will attach to the sole of the shoe. So I'm getting pretty close to having everything cut, and once I have these cut, in the next video I will show you ways of gluing and assembling this shoe together.